Good evening. My name is Dr. John Herron. I'm the Executive Director of the Kansas City Public Library, and I want to both welcome and thank you for being here tonight. We are coming to you virtually once again, as we've done with all of our signature programming for more than a year. We are proud of the role the library has played and will no doubt continue to play in helping our community navigate this pandemic. Over this past year, we have adapted and innovated, even expanded the essential resources we provide. But we are also anxious to return to full operations. I'm happy to tell you that we are getting so very close. More information about that soon. In the meantime, we are thankful that we can continue to gather as a community online, that we can explore and celebrate history and literature, two particular passions of mine, and address important issues of equity and social justice. It's also exciting that we can join in remembering a man, Langston Hughes, born in southwestern Missouri in the early years of the last century, who so masterfully infused political justice into his work. Tonight's program is special, part of a year-long series, Lift Every Voice, nationwide celebration of 250 years of African-American poetry, presented in partnership with the Library of America and the New York Public Library's Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture. It comes during April's National Poetry Month and is part of our approach to the selection of the inaugural recipient of a brand new national literary honor, the Maya Angelou Book Award. The Kansas City Public Library is collaborating with 6 universities across the state on this award that recognizes authors and notable new releases of American fiction and poetry with a focus on social justice. We can think of no better way to honor Maya Angelou, another Missouri native, and we have been gratified by the strong interest in this award. We will announce the first winner at our annual Writers for Readers event next September. Maya Angelou was, in many respects, the literary heir to Langston Hughes. As a poet, playwright, and novelist, Hughes was a pillar of the Harlem Renaissance movement of the 1920s and 30s. His work championed the everyday experience, just as it gave us vivid insight into Black life in America. He celebrated that culture while still rightfully condemning racial inequality and injustice. With us to discuss this legacy is an authority on Langston Hughes, University of Kansas English professor John Edgar Tidwell. He is joined by Kevin Young, director of the Smithsonian Institute's National Museum of African American History and Culture. But opening the evening is one of Kansas City's own literary treasures, Glenn North, who acknowledges Hughes and other Harlem Renaissance poets as key influences in his work. Mr. North was the inaugural poet laureate of our city's 18th and Vine Jazz District, served as poet in residence at the American Jazz Museum, and currently serves as the director of the Bruce R. Watkins Cultural Heritage Center. Glenn could not be with us live tonight, but he graciously recorded his reflections on Langston Hughes' lasting impact on him and on our country. Glenn?
Thanks, John. As a poet, I am extremely excited to be here tonight. And what I've noticed throughout the complicated history of this country that we call America, from Phyllis Wheatley to Amanda Gorman, Black poets have continually lifted their voices to sing of freedom. As a student of African American poetry, I find myself constantly returning to the Harlem Renaissance for inspiration. And of course, one of the leaders of that cultural revolution was my literary hero, Langston Hughes. Mr. Hughes taught us that we could be unapologetically Black in our pursuit of excellence. His unmatched prolificity has given us an enormous body of work that is as relevant today as it was nearly 100 years ago. Take, for instance, his essay, The Negro Artist and the Racial Mountain, in which he stated, "Let the blare of Negro jazz bands and the bellowing voice of Bessie Smith singing the blues penetrate the closed ears of the colored near intellectuals until they listen and perhaps understand. Let Paul Robeson singing Waterboy and Rudolph Fisher writing about the streets of Harlem and Gene Toomer holding the heart of Georgia in his hands and Aaron Douglas drawing strange Black fantasies cause the smug Negro middle class to turn from their white, respectable, ordinary books and papers to catch a glimmer of their own beauty. We younger Negro artists who create now intend to express our individual dark-skinned selves without fear or shame. If white people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, it doesn't matter. We know we are beautiful and ugly too. the tom-tom cries and the tom-tom laughs. If colored people are pleased, we are glad. If they are not, their displeasure doesn't matter either. We build our temples for tomorrow, strong as we know how, and we stand on top of the mountain, free within ourselves. I also think of the relevance of his brilliant poem, Let America Be America Again, where in the closing lines he states, "Oh yes, I say it plain. America was never America to me, and yet I swear this oath, America will be. Out of the rack and ruin of our gangster death, the rape and rot of graft and stealth and lies, we, the people, must redeem the lands, the mines, the plants, the rivers, the mountains, and the endless plain, all the stretch of these great green states, and make America again." As serious as Mr. Hughes was about the plight of Black folks in America, he always managed to inject humor in his own unique way. So I leave you with what Mr. Hughes referred to as his motto. I play it cool and dig all jive. That's the reason I stay alive. My motto, as I live and learn, is dig and be dug in return. Thank you so much for having me. I have no doubt you will enjoy the rest of your evening.
Well, thank you, Glenn, for that informed perspective, and thank you for our guests for pausing with us while we had some technical issues. We now turn to our special guest to continue this examination of Langston Hughes' life and work. Professor Tidwell has taught at a number of institutions, including the University of Kentucky, Miami University, and since 2008, the University of Kansas. He concentrates his research on African American and American literature. An editor of 7 books, including 2 on Hughes, as well as dozens of additional book chapters and invited essays, Dr. Tidwell also directed a very unique program, Reading and Remembering Langston Hughes, a series of poetry circles held in various Kansas communities to discuss the works of Hughes and his impact. Our second guest is Kevin Young, the Andrew W. Mellon Director of the Smithsonian's National Museum of African American History and Culture, one of my favorite sites in Washington. Before his arrival there, he held an endowed chair in creative writing at Emory University, and following that, he directed the Schomburg Center for Research in Black Culture in New York. Educated at Harvard and Stanford and with an MFA from Brown University, he is the author of multiple books on poetry, 2 nonfiction works, and currently serves as the poetry editor for The New Yorker. Edgar and Kevin will be joined by 2 younger members of our community, Tahraji Milsap and Jayden James, who will read a small selection of Hughes's poems and join the conversation about Hughes's legacy. Edgar and Kevin, it is a privilege to have you with us tonight.
Thanks so much.
Thank you so much. Go ahead, Kevin.
Oh no, I was just still resonating with all that great Hughes in the air that Glenn brought us, and thank you so much, John, for that introduction, and Edgar, it's so good to see you.
Indeed.
So I thought we might kick off in a minute by hearing The Negro Speaks of Rivers, which, as you know, is one of Hughes's signature poems, but also one of his earliest. But I guess I want to just talk with you a little bit about origins. And, you know, he's from this area. I grew up in Topeka in part, and Hughes spent time there as well as Lawrence. And so I wonder how you think that influenced Hughes, that landscape, but also that time there.
It's a fascinating question for me because I see us as having a kind of a Kansas reunion. I'm from Independence, Kansas. I'm from Southeast Kansas. You're from Topeka. And Langston Hughes spent his formative years in Topeka, as in Lawrence, but also in Topeka and a little bit in Kansas City. We were able to, when I say we, there was a group of us who got together and formed the Dream Documentary Collective. And we managed to get a major grant from, then called the Kansas Humanities Council. And we made a very short film on Langston. And it's titled Langston's Lawrence. And you can find it very easily online. One of the limitations of the film was that we were restricted to 7 or 8 minutes. And I think we managed to keep it within 8 minutes, but it was rough. But nevertheless, I'm seeing this as sort of a special opportunity because you have Kansas represented, I think, in a very powerful way. With regard to Hughes in particular, I'm convinced that the time that he spent here, what we call his formative years, were reflected in a lot of things that he managed to do later on in life. For example, when he was born in Joplin, Missouri, he came here at a very early age, like about he may have been 1 year old at the time. He stayed with his grandmother because his mother, Carrie, was one of those who was always out and about trying to find a way to make a living and so forth. She would periodically come back and get him and take him. And on one of those occasions of coming back and retrieving him, as it were, she took him to Topeka. And there she enrolled him in one of the elementary schools, which was actually segregated, but she managed to get a special dispensation for him. And there was an important lesson that he learned there. He learned that it was a misnomer to think about all white people as being the same. When he would be coming home from school, some of the rowdier white boys would throw rocks and chase him home. But he looked up and he discovered that there were some white boys who were also throwing rocks at the other ones, trying to protect him and shield him. And from that, he learned that not to gauge all people or tar them with the same brush. Think about them as individuals. And that's something that gets reflected in a lot of the poetry that we see him write. So the list of things that were influential in his life sort of go on from there. I mean, it's quite extensive. I'd probably call attention to the relationship he had with his grandmother. Yeah. There were a lot of times when he would just sit on her lap and she would narrate stories about the family, which was a very prestigious and historically important family. And so he was, I think, imbued with the sense of the importance of history just by sitting on his grandmother's lap.
Well, and that's right. And they were connected to Harper's Ferry, so he had a sense not just of history, but of justice and maybe what's right in the face of what's being seen as wrong in a way, and liberation and what the cost of it, the perils. I think things that, I think growing up in Topeka were still in the air and something I was trying to write about when I was thinking about the Brown v. Board case. There's also, as you know, quite a community, we don't always think of it, in Topeka itself, of Black folks around that turn of the century. There's Black newspapers, there's Black publications. I saw that the Denver Art Museum has a clutch of photographs up right now, you can see online, of Denver, hosted in Denver, but it's of Topeka Black folks who worked at the Jayhawker and other places. So it's a fascinating visual accompaniment to what we're talking about. Mm-hmm. And that way that the poet you may know, Eric McHenry, learned that he probably was born a year earlier instead of 1902, 1901. Yes. And so that kind of discovery, I think, happened because of the Black newspapers that were there in Topeka, which we don't always think of. But I think also that core Black community is important to remember moving forward. And he always sort of was able to recreate community wherever he went, even in Russia, and I think that's what's a fascinating thing about Hughes. Also, I think he that travel part of that, Kansas, at least to my mind, has these big vistas. And he, I think, always was looking over the horizon in a way and traveling and had that ability. Certainly his mom must have had something to do with that. But a poem like The Negro Speaks of Rivers has a different kind of travel. To me, it's a travel through time and space, but through an eye that he manages to kind of keep the same, and it jumps around and does this beautiful consistency, almost in a blues way, that I think is really powerful. And maybe we should hear it now and then we can talk about it.
I've known rivers. I've known rivers ancient as a world and older than the flow of human blood in human veins. My soul has grown deep like the rivers. I bathed in the Euphrates when dawns were young. I built my hut near the Congo and it lulled me to sleep. I looked upon the Nile and it raised pyramids above it. I heard the singing of the Mississippi when Abe Lincoln went down to New Orleans, and I've seen its muddy bosom turn all golden in the sunset. I've known rivers, ancient, dusky rivers. My soul has grown deep like the rivers.
It's great to hear that.
Well, yes, it is. I often wondered where the inspiration for that came from. And you'd ask about Langston and Lawrence. Well, you know, by nature, he was a very lonely young man. And he spent a lot of time in the Carnegie Library. And right over here, I'm speaking to you from Lawrence, Kansas. And right over here on 9th and Vermont. And it's sort of fascinating because he read all of the books he possibly could. And for him, words became a greater reality than dealing with people themselves. And so with the incredible amount of reading and learning that he gained from that, I'm sure that ultimately it began to, I'll borrow from one of our women writers here who said that she would read everything and then she would strip herself bare. And by that I mean, and I think she meant, what she would do is to have all these things sort of become digested in a way, so that as she began to think about ways in which to articulate herself, then some of the things would naturally just come from this wonderful cauldron of a mixture of ideas. And I think the same thing could be said of Langston, and as a result of his experiences there in the public library here in Lawrence. I guess the story of his writing this poem is rather familiar. He was on his way back to see his father and perhaps live with him for the second time after Langston had graduated from high school in 1920. And as he was taking the train across the Mississippi River, the sun was starting to go down, and all of a sudden he became invested with a lot of different emotions and feelings and ideas and thoughts. And as he looked at all of those things percolating, he pulled out an envelope, and on the back of the envelope, he began to scribble the lines. And the lines he scribbled came out to be the poem, The Negro Speaks of Rivers. And I think he said the next day he may have changed one or two lines, but for the most part, it remained pretty much as it was. And so we know that this poem was important because ultimately it became his signature poem. It was his first major publication, but it's also the one poem that he would read, and all his poetry readings, he would read it last. And that made it into his signature poem. Well, one of the ways in which this poem became important to everybody else was that Jesse Foster, who was the book review editor for Crisis Magazine, received a bunch of poems from Langston. And out of that, she looked at the Negro Speaks of Rivers, and she was just taken with it. I mean, she was bowled over. She saw something very special taking place. And so what she wanted to do then was to publish that. So that became his first major publication in 1921. So that's why here we are in 2021, celebrating this centenary, the centennial of the publication of that particular poem.
Well, and I love that story about taking the train because it also, the grabbing the envelope right in the back, it also feels like a Gettysburg Address story about Lincoln grabbing something and you know, Lincoln's figure so hugely in the poem. Maybe this is a good time to talk a little bit about the Harlem Renaissance and our sense of that. I'm sure you would agree that the Harlem Renaissance didn't only take place in Harlem. And some would say it took place in Paris just as much. I certainly think there were many figures who were from elsewhere, including Aaron Douglas, who was from Topeka, the wonderful illustrator artist. And who did many of Hughes's books, starting with his second. So I'm just curious how you see him in terms of the Harlem Renaissance. Obviously, he's a central figure, but for me, he becomes this person who does make us understand all the different parts. He lives in DC, he lives in Paris, he ends up broke in Italy, he goes to the continent, which is to say Africa. So he has a lot of the journeys that I think people are sometimes only writing about, but he also is going. County Cullen loved Paris, but didn't get there till years later, So tell me how you see him in terms of the Harlem Renaissance.
Well, one of the things I wrestle with is how to convince folk that he was more than a Harlem Renaissance poet, all right? If you notice, most of the things that you read about him was that he was a great figure of the Harlem Renaissance. Well, what about the 1930s? What about the 1940s, the 50s, and before he dies in the 1960s? He was distinguished in each of those decades. So I'm not trying to take anything away from his involvement in the Renaissance. I would just simply say that we don't want to pigeonhole him. We want to think about him in his broadest context. And if we think about him in that broadest context, then we can see how there are a number of relationships that he established in the so-called Harlem Renaissance for the very reasons that you just named. The Renaissance itself, I really don't prefer the term Harlem Renaissance because I think what it does, it makes people think only in terms of Harlem. But if you think about either the new Negro Renaissance or the new Negro movement,
sure,
or as Langston calls it, the Black Renaissance, then what you're doing is you're spreading the ways in which art and culture and politics were pervasive in these years.
Good reminder.
Okay, all right. So, I'm not preaching at you, but I'm just trying to say that.
I even running an institution like the Schomburg in Harlem, which Hughes loved and wrote about and went to, which was founded in 1925 in a Carnegie Library, a formerly established Carnegie Library in 1905. But in 1925, it becomes what eventually we know as the Schomburg Center. And Hughes's ashes are there today under the floor there. It's a beautiful site. You don't see the ashes, but the beautiful art by Houston Conwell there above his ashes, and his repose there, I think really energizes the space. But, even in the heart of Harlem, it is true that there were many vectors. And I think Harlem is a Black cultural capital, and that's why it's almost a shorthand. But also, most of those folks did pass through it in some way. But you're absolutely right that to think of Hughes only in 1921 or 26 or what have you is to limit him. I have the same thing around, his work as a busboy, which is absolutely true. He was very self-aware, and the picture he took, he used it as marketing. He had a sheaf of poems at the ready to give to who was one of the most famous poets of the time, to sort of promote him. He already had a book in the works, so he was very savvy, But I think you touched on an important thing that came up for me when I was editing the anthology, African American Poetry, 200 years of struggle and song, which is the springboard for Lift Every Voice. And for me, I was really struck by the way he, of course, crosses many decades, 4 or 5, and we have to contend with him, like you say, throughout. And the work just, a little like Gwendolyn Brooks, too, native Topekan, who whose work really stretches across time. And, the hardest thing was trying to put them in different eras, which is what I wanted to do. But, you have to know that Ask Your Mama, his late, terrific, beautifully named epic from the 60s, was very much talking to the times that were around. He was very aware of what's going on. And then the poems that eventually he gathered in Panther and the Lash, which includes some earlier radical poems that he couldn't publish in the 30s, really, that's what I had on my parents' bookshelf. That's when I first got to peer into Langston Hughes, does something similar. It gathers decades of work under a radical eye that I think is really important.
Well, one of the things I found fascinating about his autobiography, the first one, is that if you notice where it ends, all right, it doesn't end in 1938, 39 when he's writing it and publishing it in 1940. He ends it right about 1932, maybe, about 1932. And so the question is why, all right? If you think about him in terms of, and this goes for Hurston and it goes for Richard Wright as well. If you think about them in 1940 and the state of America at that time, America was about to enter the Second World War. Sure. And publishers were not going to publish anything that seemed to be a critique of America itself. It would be like subverting the whole notion of patriotism. So what he did was sort of accede to the wishes of the publisher, and he ended it where he did so that he could get it actually published. And see, Zora Neale Hurston went through the same thing with Dust Tracks on the Road. She had a lot of things in there that seemed to be favorable to some of the Japanese warriors. And she knew, of course, that if she wanted to get it published, and she was going to have to excise that from the manuscripts. So she did. With Richard Wright, Black Boy was actually one half of the total autobiography that he was writing, right? So, but he ended it in such a way so that he too could get it published.
One Library of America just brought out The Man Who Lived Underground, novel, which had a similar history of being trimmed down in the 40s. And so you raised an interesting point. Some have said the Harlem Renaissance, I think traditionally once upon a time, was talked about as ending in 32, but it might be just as much backward looking artificial stop date, because I think once you extend it, you see the politics of the new Negro movement living on into the 30s and becoming in many ways even more radical. Certainly what I enjoy is thought in the anthology of how broad the Renaissance is, how broad you can see people writing from an LGBTQ perspective, people writing from all different vantage points. And really, there was almost a generational divide in the Harlem Renaissance or the New Negro Renaissance from Du Bois and others who wanted art to be a certain way, and Hughes, as Glenn's so beautiful reading of the Negro artist and the racial, saying, we want to be ourselves. We want to write about we know we're ugly and beautiful too. I think that quality you see throughout Hughes. And his wrestling with questions of politics, I think, plays widely. Maybe we should hear I too.
Let me, you raise a very interesting point about where it ends and maybe where it begins. It's always a question of periodization, right? Where does the movement begin? Where does it end? And I've discovered a long time ago that what we're looking at when people say it ended in 1932 or it ended in 1936, the editor of those books claim a date that works for them. In other words, they want to include certain people. And so they define the period in such a way so that those people can indeed be included. Sure. So you can go back the other way and look to see where it actually began. And it's the same sort of issue. It's all sort of defined by the editor and the editorial needs. So that's why there cannot be. It's good. Sorry about that.
But I think your point is well taken. But also, these things having been in things like now, which I think we're in the Renaissance, which I hope we can talk about a little bit in a moment. But where does it begin? Where does it end? How do we define it? That's part of what being in the moment is about. And sometimes you only know you're in the moment a little later. Let's hear I Too. I think it'd be really nice to hear that right now.
I too sing America. I am the darker brother. They send me to eat in the kitchen when company comes, but I laugh and eat well and grow strong. Tomorrow, I'll be at the table when company comes. Nobody'll dare say to me, eat in the kitchen. Then, besides, they'll see how beautiful we are and be ashamed. I too am America.
That's a magnificent poem in the sense that it's a great statement about his affirmation of his belief in the American creed. And I spent a lot of time thinking about him in regard to how he is constantly in quest of the benefits of the Declaration of Independence, the Bill of Rights, and the U.S. Constitution. He's arguing for a way in which all of us can be included in that equally. The very first line, which has echoes of Walt Whitman, is a very powerful line, it seems to me, because it says, I too sing America. When he says I too, what he's suggesting is that, first of all, the I is not just him personally. He's speaking as if he's a part of the whole race. All right, so the whole race is one who celebrates what America is all about. And so when he says that, and he's celebrating America, I too sing America, we're prepared for all of the ways in which people have tried to prevent the race from becoming a part of or sharing in the benefits of what America is supposed to represent. And then he concludes on an equally powerful note when he says, for I too am America. So when you think about America in that regard, you have to understand that he's not saying, let me become a part of all of this. He says, as a group of people, we are already a part of this. It needs to be acknowledged and recognized.
Right, and by, you said it better than I could possibly. So what I would just say is something about the poetry of it, which is to say, by claiming I think he, in many ways, invented this I that's really particular. And he does that not just through an I that's Hughes himself, or could be mistaken for Hughes, as in perhaps this poem, but in other poems where he's many different I's. He speaks as a washerwoman. He speaks as a blues singer. He speaks as a blues singer, and that leap into talking about the people he wanted to write about, everyday folk, I think was really one of his inventions, leaps in the 20s that extended through his whole career. Yes. But I think it's important to think about that, because the I in a lyric poem is so powerful, and it needn't always be in a capital I, but it's also an EYE. It's a thing that's looking around and speaking from that vantage point. We've been thinking a lot in culture writ large about bystanding, witnessing, things that can be horrific. And Hughes provides us with this I, a kind of witness who can go around and talk with authority. I was there, he's saying in The Negro Speaks of Rivers. He was there in this poem. I am the darker brother, and that quality I think is really powerful. And he isn't saying I'm kind of like, I sometimes, maybe feel, he's like, I am. And you point that out for us. And I think it's really important to highlight for everyone.
Well, I'm always fascinated by the poem because he raises a number of questions that we are really wrestling with today. Coming out of slavery and Reconstruction and into Jim Crow, there are a lot of issues that were raised about, who is an American, all right? Who is a citizen? who indeed is a human being. And if you read the poem in the way in which I'm thinking that it should be read, then all those issues start coming forward, and we today are wrestling with the same concerns. So if you want an example of how he is relevant to us today, read this poem. Because what it does is it gives you a sense of, it gives you an idea of those issues as they were fought over in an earlier period, and how we're still fighting over some of those same issues.
I think too, he insists not just on humanity, which I don't think needs insisting. I mean, we don't have to prove that, but he wants the whole package. He says beautiful and ugly too. He doesn't want to just write about one thing. And there were aspects of the new Negro movement that were put on a good face, positive imagery. And he's like, I'm going to write about whatever I want. And if, white folks are happy, we are glad. If they're not, and that's what I think he's arguing over in that essay, but I think in his work as well. And so there's a powerful quality of both testimony and also testify it in a kind of folk sense. He's feeling larger than himself, and I don't know, I think it's just very moving and important. We have a bit more time, and I want to get to some of the young people who are on the call with us in a few moments, but did we want to hear one more poem, or do you want to talk just a hair more, because we also want to maybe hear Justice, I think.
Well, we certainly want to hear from the younger readers. The poem Justice might be one way in which to have a segue into bringing them into the conversation.
Perfect, let's do it.
That justice is a blind goddess is a thing to which we Black are wise. Her bandage hides to festering sores that once perhaps were eyes.
I love that poem.
Yeah, it goes very fast, right? Because
well, it does go fast. I'm sorry, go ahead.
Well, he's talking about blind justice, and he's saying she's not just blind because she's trying to be neutral, but blind from something worse. I wish we had more time. Okay, because this is reminding me of so many things. But let me just go back a little bit. One of the things I found really fascinating about this poem is that a lot of people probably dismiss it. All right, they dismiss it because they think that here you have something that is maybe a children's rhyme, or maybe it's even worse. Maybe it's just doggerel. But they don't see it as necessarily as a strong poem. It's too preachy, it's too teachy, and so forth. But I think that the simplicity of the poem belies an inherent complexity. And it's that complexity that I think that is really fascinating. This poem appeared in a collection of his radical poems published in 1938 called A New Song. And in this pamphlet, what he does is to collect some of those poems that really talk about his socialist perspective that he had developed throughout the 1930s. And so I found it kind of fascinating when we looked more deeply into this poem, Justice, because it raises all kinds of questions. There's a depth there which says that we need to be a little more attentive to some possibilities for expanding our understanding of what this poem is about. With just a little bit of context, back in 1931, he wrote a letter to Sterling Brown. And in this letter, he told Sterling that he thinks that the whole notion of what Negro art had become had been reduced to something that appealed only to the intellectuals. And so he said he wanted to write a kind of poetry that would appeal to the broadest base of African Americans. And so as he
began to think about what that might be, he thought that there should be some sort of transaction between artist, poem, and audience. But the newer poetry had forgotten what that transaction should be about. So in his own way of thinking, he was going to try to reconnect those three elements and to do it in such a way so that people, ordinary folk, would be able to tune in and be able to appreciate the poem itself. Well, Sterling Brown said, well, that's a noble idea, but it's not one that you should undertake, but he did it anyway. And so throughout the 1930s, that's the kind of poetry that you see. And I raise that question because there is a lot that goes into the way in which this very small poem raises also a number of questions that if we were thinking about the public schools and what they're able to talk about in terms of current events, this poem, I think, is a good entree into a lot of contemporary affairs. If you go back, for example, to the insurrection of January the 6th, one of the things that comes out of all this is the whole question of democracy, right? Who is democracy for? Is there one form for Blacks, another one for whites, or what? And it's the same way with the question of justice that's raised in the poem itself. It seems to suggest the same kind of issue here. So again, if you want to think about ways in which to make him relevant, then here's one poem that you could look at that would connect him with us even today. Sorry.
Oh, I think that was very necessary to hear. I think he's, I think the best poems are timely but timeless, and to me, Hughes manages that, so oddly, I think some of his his political poems aren't always the ones he thought of as the most political. A poem like Montage of a Dream Deferred, which he writes in the 50s, and Knopf, which is my longtime publisher and had been his, who wouldn't publish his poems in the 30s. And hence he later does the pamphlet, but also wouldn't publish Montage of a Dream Deferred, which is probably his most famous poem now. The lines, what happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun? Those kind of ideas, I think, are also really radical and in its form. And I guess for me, his radicalness also is tied up in music.
Yes,
it's tied up in the music he's writing about, whether it's blues music, which is folk music and people's music, but also then jazz and bebop, which he's writing about very early after he coined. He creates a whole epic around it. To me, that kind of boldness, and later in life in Ask Your Mama, he does the same thing with jazz, and that's really amazing to me how he could connect jazz to what jazz often is connected to, which is speaking as a voice, speaking against, speaking up, and all that's really powerful. So we have these lovely young folks with us tonight who read so beautifully. Thank you so much for reading. I want to just hear from you. Maybe you can introduce yourselves a little bit and maybe tell us where you came to know Langston Hughes.
You can go first.
No, you're right there.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry, I didn't want to cut anybody off. Hello, my name is Tahraji Milsap. I am 17 years old. I live in Kansas City, Missouri. And honestly, Langston Hughes has been a part of my life, kind of throughout the entire thing. My brother, actually, his name is Langston. So after Langston Hughes. And so really, like, Black poetry, Black art has been a huge part of my childhood and a part of my life. And so I really do appreciate, he's one of the poets I appreciate, especially as a writer myself, somebody that I can appreciate. So, and look to, especially during, I know that we were earlier, it was being talked about, like, how he's more than a Harlem Renaissance poet, just seeing his work throughout time, throughout history, throughout his time. is also something that I've been able to look at and benefit from, just reading about, learning about.
Great.
So, yeah, sorry, I don't want to.
No, I could listen to you all day. So you have time. Jayden?
Hey, my name's Jayden. Jayden.
Just speak up a little bit for us.
Oh, okay. Sorry. Can you hear me?
Just a little bit louder.
Oh, okay. What about now?
Great.
Okay. Let's see. What does Langston Hughes mean to me? I'd say not only Langston Hughes, but Black art in general, just kind of building on what Tahraji said. Coming from the perspective of also being a Black artist, it's really interesting to see how art from different time periods kind of shape the universal Black experience, and it doesn't really change that much. Like obviously, like the culture throughout times kind of alters, but the experience ultimately stays the same. And I think what Langston Hughes brings to that is, I guess, like a perspective that seems familiar and yet new at the same time. And I think we can see that with both the Negro Speaks of Rivers and Justice, specifically with Justice, with recently Derek Chauvin, I think that's how you say his name, I'm not sure, being found guilty on all 3 charges of the murder of George Floyd. And throughout history, we've seen that, we really don't get justice in the judicial system. So to kind of see that poem be played out today is really interesting. And then when you think about the Negro Speaks of Rivers, it talks about, not really losing your heritage or royalty from, I guess your geographical standpoint in terms of being Black, because it talks about different rivers and everything. And I think that's a very interesting topic, because when being a Black American, it's easy to lose yourself and lose your identity in like a culture that doesn't really appreciate it. So I think that's really interesting, and you can see that in art today, specifically music. Frank Ocean's song "Pyramids" speaks of a similar journey going from Africa to America current day. And Beyonce also has a visual album, Black is King, and a song titled After the Nile River, really kind of tracing back to this whole idea of tracing to your roots and having this generational journey and unification.
Wonderfully said. Ms. Milsap, did you have other things you wanted to say to us?
Yes, I definitely, I just want to take a moment. That was really great, Jayden. I really appreciate all of your viewpoints on those. And especially the fact that the experience hasn't changed. I like that perspective, and I definitely agree with that. I feel like one of the things that I was thinking about with I too was the idea of patriotism, and even how that like has changed. I feel like our generation specifically kind of shies away from owning the label of American, and shies away from viewing themselves as patriotic, because the way that we've grown up, the world that we've grown up in, is just so clearly, wow, especially for minorities and especially for African American youth. It's like America does not want us. So why would we want to be any part of this? But I think that one of the things that you can really see and appreciate, especially in I too, is like, yeah, yes, we're shoved into the kitchen, basically. And that hasn't changed, even though, segregation isn't legalized anymore. We still see it. We still see the effects of slavery, of Jim Crow. We still see, people, unfortunately, getting discriminated against and murdered. And I think that even despite that, though, there's this idea of hope that I think is very important. And I think that that's something that I think that even a lot of our generation is starting to realize, and that I've personally started to kind of realize, especially in thinking about when looking back at like Black poets and Black activists, is this hope that we are the reality of America. We're we don't only get to be a part of the American dream, but we are a part of the American reality. And that reality is not perfect yet, but that was something that we were a part of, you know? And I think that you can see that in We Too Sing America. We are America. And so I think that that's something that I think is starting to kind of catch on, and people are starting to realize like that all of the worst parts of America are not the only parts of America, and that we are America too. And I think that that's something you can really see in his work as well.
Beautifully said. I don't think we can say, yeah, that's beautifully said. We too sing America, like you said. Thank you so much. I think we can go back to just the two of us talking, and we can visit with you all later if we have time in the Q&A.
Would this be a good time to hear Glenn North reading the Mississippi, Money, Mississippi, 1955 poem?
1955, yeah, it says 95 here.
55.
Oh, what sorrow, oh, what pity, oh, what pain, the tears and blood should mix like rain, and terror come again to Mississippi. Come again, where has terror been? On vacation up north in some other section of the nation, lying low unpublicized, masked with only jaundiced eyes showing through the mask. Oh, what sorrow, pity, pain, the tears and blood should mix like rain in Mississippi, and terror, fetid, hot, yet clammy cold, remain.
Boy, that's a powerful few minutes on hearing that Hughes. I mean, there's so much to talk about, I think, but I think that idea of singing and struggle to me was very much at the heart of what I was trying to do in the anthology. It's the subtitle of the anthology. And I think Black poets across time, and I was interested to hear those comments about things are changed, but things are the same, and how that continuity, we might say, is there. And for me, I saw that doing this anthology, the ways that poets have been protesting just from sitting down and writing, just from sort of violating laws against literacy, from violating laws of propriety and what should be said and what shouldn't be said. But in this particular poem, the reference to Emmett Till is loud and clear, and you sort of see that connection across the anthology too. I'd say Emmett Till was the subject that poets most return to, and such a powerful, not just symbol, but moment and galvanizing force, but also something that, my poem, I have one poem in the anthology, and it's about Emmett Till. Making a pilgrimage to see not his grave, but where he was taken from, the shop, which is now crumbling, where he did nothing at all, we know now. We should have suspected all along. I guess what I would say is, I think about that long line of poets writing, and now that I'm the director of the National Museum of African American History and Culture, we have Emmett Till's casket there. And one of the more powerful experiences of my life to line up, I happened to visit with my son, who is roughly his age, and to walk through and wait, much as those people did, to see Emmett Till's body. And Hughes refers to it there as a mask. And I think that visage is so powerful and haunting. And you saw in the verdict that was just last night, Emmett Till's family was there with George Floyd's family. And that connection is both inspiring and haunting, and I think was put so well there about the singing and the struggle that is always ongoing, it seems.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. One of the things that always comes to my mind is the place of Emmett Till in the civil rights movement. Sure. In 1955, you had him lynched in the most gruesome way. And a little later in that same year, Rosa Parks was selected not to give up her seat. And it seems to me that if you wanted to have a date for the modern day civil rights movement, you might connect those two together and see what happens after that. And so when I look at the poem and think about the poem itself, it always reminds me of the way in which all these historical events occurred in ways that the writers picked up on them and made use of them. And while I don't think Hughes was thinking in terms of how does this relate to the civil rights movement, I think what he was doing, though, was putting in place a very important historical event and meditating on it in such a way so that it gave him an opportunity to give voice to some of the things that troubled him. I was watching the news yesterday, and I noticed the reaction that a lot of people had to the verdict that was rendered in the Chauvin trial. And it was almost as if people for the first time were able to exhale. You know, there was a sense of relief. And and understandably so, because for the whole of the past year, people have been on pins and needles. There's always been the question of, will there be justice meted out in this particular crime or what? But to see the sense of relief that so many people felt, you know, I thought about Langston in that regard, that writing this poem probably gave him an opportunity to rid himself of a lot of the anxiety that had built up. And it's probably short-lived because there were other poems. You mentioned the whole collection of the posthumously published work that he did. And there's one poem in there, Death in Yorkville, about the death of this 14-year-old young man. And so I would say that for Langston, there was always this constant need to call attention to the kinds of atrocities that African Americans had suffered. And as you so very nicely put it, you know, it was a way by which he always seemed to come back to a need to make sure that we understood the experiences of African American people.
Well, and I think I would say, you know, it's a kind of blues aesthetic in the sense that what I learned from the blues is what he talks about, which is laughing to keep from crying. So it isn't only the sorrowful parts of struggle, it's also the joyous survivals, resistance, however you want to think of it. I think we've all had to find our own joy, sometimes hard won, if not always. And especially in this past year, it's become fairly stark. And to me, one of the things art does well and poetry can do well is talk about all those sides of being Black and being awake, being alive. And you know, if it was all everything's great, it wouldn't be believable. And if it was all, you know, only one other thing, it wouldn't be believable. And I think he's able to kind of, especially in his longer works, give you the humor, the distance, the simple stories, I think, are filled with that folk humor, and the blues too are filled with that. And you know, as you know, the blues might sound sad, but you listen to them and you feel a little happier, even if it's just knowing someone else is worse off than you.
Sure.
So before we turn to questions, are there any last things you want us to to say, to remind people of, or leave them with when you talk about Hughes?
Well,
we'll have a chance to loop back, but I didn't know if there was something on your mind right now.
I think one of the things that that connects, that I've been trying to connect lately, is Langston Hughes with a lot of contemporary ideas that are taking place. And one of the ideas that I keep coming back to is the notion of how we as a people, African-American people, have always been wedded to the creed of America, the principles on which America stands. The problem has always been the practice of that creed. It has always subverted our efforts to become full and participating partners in what America is supposed to represent. And so especially when I saw the outcome of the trial yesterday, I began thinking again about, it's time for people to move ahead. And by that, I mean, that was a wonderful outcome to the trial. The prosecuting attorneys did a magnificent job. I would have been so disappointed if they had been ignored by the jury and had set that man free. All right. So I began thinking a lot about who is it that's actually responsible for us as a people being able to participate more fully in the American dream, if you will. And it occurred to me that if you go back to 1619, we came here as indentured servants, and very shortly after that, we became reclassified as chattel slaves, you see. And from 1619 on up, the burden for African Americans to be recognized as human beings, to become full participants in what America is supposed to represent, has fallen on our shoulders. And the problem is that as much as we have struggled and much as we have striven to do things that would indicate that we are worthy, that we are really a part of it, that we too are America, it all gets subverted by one thing. And that's the whole notion of white supremacy. And when I thought about that, I came to think about Dr. King. And there's something that he wrote that I thought was just extremely powerful. In his book, Where Do We Go From Here? Chaos or Community. He says, it is time for all of us to tell each other the truth about who and what have brought the Negro to the condition of deprivation against which he struggles today. And that one sentence there sort of distilled a number of issues for me. And it made me think in terms of what solutions can be offered to move us off that dime so that the responsibility doesn't rest just with Black people, that it rests with everyone. And so you can ask 100 people and you'll get 100 different answers to the question. But one of the people who probably provided a good answer for me was the Black feminist June Jordan. June Jordan has this magnificent essay that she wrote back in 1978, I think it was. And in this essay, the essay is titled, Where is the Love? And she has a little portion there, if I can find it right quick, that is so very, very powerful, because what it does is it lays out the issue that I think many of us need to be thinking about. She says that the health, the legitimacy of any status quo, any governing force, must be measured according to the experiences of those who are comparatively powerless. Virtue is not to be discovered in the conduct of the strong vis-a-vis the powerful, but rather is to be found in our behavior and policies affecting those who are different, those who are weaker or smaller than we? How do the strong, the powerful treat children? How do we treat the aged among us? How do the strong and the powerful treat so-called minority members of the body politic? How do the powerful regard women? How do they treat us? When I thought about that little portion of the longer essay that she wrote, I keep coming back to the role of the humanities in all of this. I do a little bit of work for Humanities Kansas. And one of the things that I always try to do is to engage people in a way so they can see how it's okay to question who they are and what they are all about. Because I'm a firm believer in personal transformation. If you really want to get rid of white supremacy, what you have to do is to get people to understand that they themselves have to rethink who they are in relationship to everybody else. And this is where personal transformation comes in. This is where the humanities, I think, are very powerful and very potent. And this is where I believe if there's going to be any real movement toward social change, it has to be in terms of what we see in terms of how people themselves have to take responsibility for who they are and how they themselves can redefine their relationship to the body politic in a way so that it becomes more inclusive, so it becomes more welcoming, so it becomes an acknowledgement that this is not just for a few, but it's for the many. So I'm trying to work this idea through so I can write it out and make it less like a polemic of some sort. But this is, you asked, so this is what's been on my mind of late in relationship to Langston Hughes. Because I believe he does give us a pathway. He gets us started down this pathway so that we can begin to investigate these kinds of questions.
Well, I'm glad you mentioned June Jordan because she was so important to me and I think becomes more important every day in her poetry and her essays, which you remind us are really powerful. In fact, one of the essays she wrote, The Difficult Miracle, titles the introduction to the anthology I did. And, I think that difficult miracle is such a beautiful way of expressing the Black experience in America. We have a number of questions about the experience, but also about Hughes. One is particularly for you, and these are in the chat. You can put them, I think, on YouTube in the chat. And one is for you that says, do you think Langston Hughes is properly embraced and celebrated? Does he have the stature he should in Kansas today? He always said he considered it home. And I'm going to lump in the next question, which is similar, which is someone says, growing up in rural Missouri, I went through 12 years of school without ever hearing of him. How do we fix that? What do you think?
The first one was a lot easier to answer than the second one.
Well, do you think he, maybe the second one answers the first one, but do you think he's embraced enough?
No, he's not. But he is starting to get more recognition here in Lawrence, especially, and I think more widely across the state. As many of us go around to different public libraries and talk about different aspects of the humanities, inevitably we invoke Langston Hughes' name. And so that becomes a way by which to make him more widely known within the state itself. But while we've made a great deal of progress, I still think we have a long way to go. The second half of the question, though, the second question, is a more difficult one to answer because there's so many variables that have to be dealt with before you can begin to think about Hughes in the way that he is such an influential figure. For example, if you're thinking about the public schools, I grew up in Southeast Kansas, independent, and much of my education, I think, was very traditional, and in that regard, it was very, very good. But I never had a Black teacher. We never really dealt with Black subject matter when I was coming along. And so it wasn't until I got to Washburn for undergraduate studies that I began to see a little bit. And it wasn't until I got to my master's program that I actually had a Black teacher, all right? So part of the difficulty is, can you get textbooks that would be diverse enough to include somebody like a Langston Hughes? And I say somebody like him only because we know so much now. Here we are in 2021. And part of the difficulty with putting together a textbook is that editorial decisions have to be made. Who's going to be included? Who's going to be excluded, and why? You see?
Yeah, having done 13 anthologies, the idea that is evergreen in that sense. And I think, at least over my time, I certainly champion him when I can, and I hope people can find resources. I know a lot of us are at home and might be teaching or with young people. There's a lot of good online resources that can turn you on to Hughes.
Oh, yes. Oh, sure.
So I hope people can seek him out. But I certainly know, growing up in Topeka, I never heard Hughes' poems. I think I vaguely knew he had lived there, but certainly it was as an adult and coming to understand how important it is that I saw not just Hughes in isolation, because I think that's one thing, but also Hughes as part of a community. And that's what I would stress as we talk about writers. Sometimes we tend to have one at a time, or this one over here, and fail to connect them to the long stream, the difficult miracle of poetry. And so it's important to include that.
Yeah, and growing up in Independence, my mother was from Oklahoma, and one of her brothers lived in Omaha for most of his adult life, and he would come down periodically, and the most amazing thing transpired, and I didn't realize it at the time, but this was truly amazing. He would start off reciting a long poem by Paul Laurence Dunbar. Now, mind you, this is maybe 50 years after he'd been away from high school, but still, that was one of the pedagogical techniques, was that students memorize, poems. And so he remembered 50 years later, most of the poem. And then when he began to falter a little bit, my mother would step in and she would pick up and take off where he left off. Right. And it was the most amazing kind of performance that I think I've ever seen. And I guess part of the problem is that once I recognized that there was something very special happening here, I didn't have my tape recorder, and I could not preserve it in any way except in the appreciation that I developed. And so I think one of the reasons that I'm sitting here talking to you goes back to the kind of performance that they provided, and the sort of inspiration that came from the performance that they undertook.
Well, and I think, if you memorize a poem, people got away from that for some valid reasons, but there is something about that that's really meaningful. You carry it in your body, and it's partially yours. It's your breath, and I think poems aren't really completed until they're heard aloud and have that breath put into them by the reader. And Hughes especially, I think, serves that well. So it's beautifully put. And I too wish I had heard it, but just as good. So a couple last things before we get out of here. One is that someone asked about how they can get the anthology. Someone wrote here very wisely, Mary Sutton, who's with Library America, please visit www.loa.org to get the anthology, and you get up to almost 30% discount on that. So I didn't even know that. I'm gonna go there now. I'm looking. That's a good deal, but also please support your library. Library of America, our publisher here, is so important. They're doing such important work. So that's a great place for it. Let's see. There's another question too that I think our teens might have a lot to say about, which is growing up in, it's would the teens, either one of them, I'd love to have both of them answer this, would they share how they would go about convincing a friend that they should read Hughes's work? And Jayden specifically said he wanted to answer that. Can Jayden do that first? And
Okay, so I was actually talking about the question before that, but I mean, I can
answer what you need to. Let's hear from both of you, and then we'll end with Professor Tidwell.
Okay, it's fine if I go now?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So for the first question, it was asking, how do we fix Langston Hughes not being taught in schools? And I think,
sure, yeah, similar questions.
I think kind of like one of the first things we need to do is really just incorporate the Black and unbiased opinion of the Black experience into our school systems, because oftentimes textbooks, they'll say, oh, they'll just kind of cut everything. It'll be slavery, the Harlem Renaissance, segregation, Martin Luther King, that's it. They don't really take the time to well into the full experience and what that means for Black Americans in the past, present, and future. And I think it also requires a shift in the perspective of the educators, because a lot of the educators don't think that's important, or if they do, they don't want to, I guess, spread that knowledge to their Black students, if that makes sense. Because I don't know if Tahraji wants to speak on this, but we both come from a school where a lot of educators tend to have a white savior complex when it comes to teaching, and that just kind of really throws us in a loop, because our education isn't really valued, our experiences aren't really valued. And that's not to say that's the case for all staff members, but I believe that it has to start at the foundation, and that's the educators and the people running the schools, and changing their opinions and perspectives on that subject matter. And then the second question was, how would I go about convincing?
Well, I think we're low on time, so I want to make sure that you're able to jump in there too. Whatever you want. It's fine.
I would like to build on that first question. I would love to build on the first question. I think that it's very important to, if we want to start fostering more of those conversations, I think that it's really important to diversify the staff in a lot of schools. I feel like I think I kind of alluded to this earlier, but especially in Kansas City, there's a clear racial divide in terms of the city. Really, a lot of people know about it, the truce divide. And so I think that also goes into schools and what resources schools are able to get on either side of the divide or dividing line. And I feel like that's a really important step, addressing that and diversifying the not only the student body, but especially the staff of the people at these schools, because for a lot of schools, it's either one problem. I think that one problem that I've sort of found, and I think Jayden talked about this a little bit, is that there are a lot of in some schools there's a lot of white staff members who are well-meaning but are not able to obviously really talk about that experience or talk about and who are not as motivated even if they try in different ways, like through Black History Month. Black History Month at our school is something that is celebrated. At the same time, though, like Jayden talked about, there is a very kind of copy and paste feeling to it, where every year is there are certain things that are just check these boxes and not really talking about these people. So we talk about, yes, Langston Hughes existed as a poet in the Harlem Renaissance, but who was he? What did he write? What did he believe in? What more was he? Because that's another thing, is a lot of the people and Black history, I feel like, are also kind of breezed over. They are a label. Rosa Parks sat on the bus, and we know nothing else about her, and we learn nothing more about her, and there's no one interested, or no one properly motivated, I think, to talk about those things. So,
well, I think that was. I appreciate both your perspective, and I almost have to link it back to Professor Tidwell saying he didn't have a teacher until graduate school, and that kind of. I think my second grade teacher was Black, which I came home and probably told my mom some like she looks like me, I think is what I said. I think that's so important, and I appreciate you reminding us. And Hughes, I think, interestingly, as you point out, went to integrated schools much of his life. He in Kansas and in, I mean, integrated might not be the right word, but schools that had white populations that were maybe larger. Ohio too, he had that experience, and so it's interesting to think about Hughes in that setting, and you all in the setting you're talking about. And again, I try to look for continuities, and I don't want to give a shameless plug for the museum as a place for rich history, but I think it is a place, both online and in person, where you can see that full range of African American experience and its centrality to the American story, which is something that I think Hughes helped convince me of, and Hughes kept reminding us of, both in his poetry and in his being. He was unapologetically Black, and actually sort of whispers to you, it's a little bit fun too, and I think there's something about that I think puts a bone in the back and is really powerful and empowering. Black like me, that notion I think was really important for the Renaissance more fully, and for Hughes specifically. Thank you all for joining us tonight, young folks. I look forward to hearing more from you and seeing you in the museum and seeing you around. I want to end quickly with Professor here. Tell me, what do you think's next? I mean, you talked a little bit about Hughes and right now, and I was mentioning, I think we're low on time, so I was mentioning Hughes and the current Renaissance, which I think takes its inspiration from these previous Renaissances, right? But I wonder how you see Hughes now, and what do you see the future of thinking about him? I know you're thinking about him in your own way, as you mentioned, but how are we going to see Hughes in the future?
I think one of the things that we'll all probably, if we think about 100 years from now, I think one of the things we'll probably do is to look at some of the later works of Langston Hughes as a way by which to remember the overall quality of his work, because we can see a range of development. You had mentioned the whole question of Ask Your Mama. I'm not sure if there's another poem quite like that one, and but I would put any amount of money that I had on whether or not that might be the one poem 100 years from now that he might be remembered for.
Yeah, I love that. Well, and it has these great appearances and jokes, but also this deep rolling kind of format. I remember back on my shelves, I'll spare you my show and tell, but that was one of the first sort of early editions of Hughes that I bought, and I was just blown away by it. It's oblong, it has like salmon colored paper.
Yes.
It's printed on blue ink. I mean, it's very unusual, and in the best possible way. It blew me away, and it made me, I was fortunate enough, years later to be on the same publisher. And to me, there was something about that continuity that spoke to me just personally. Growing up in Topeka, being on the same publisher, I felt like Hughes was close at hand. But I think your point is well taken. That's a musical, rolling, indicting, unafraid, late genius poem that we should know more about. It's in his collected poems. Excerpts are in the anthology too. So please check that out if you don't know it already.
Okay.
Well, what a evening. I hate to stop there. I hate to stop at all, but I think that's a good place to stop.
It probably is. Thank you, Kevin.
Thank you. It's great to see everyone.
Yeah.